ABC General Hospital Spoilers reveal that the shock did not arrive with noise, but with a quiet confirmation that felt far more unsettling than any dramatic exit ever could have. Kirsten Storms, a face so deeply woven into the emotional fabric of General Hospital, was no longer under contract. The word spread quickly, but what lingered was not just the fact itself, it was the implication behind it. For years, Maxie had been more than a character. She had been a pulse inside Port Charles, a chaotic, vulnerable, fiercely loyal force who could collapse and rise again in the same breath. And now, without warning, that pulse seemed to falter. Not because the story demanded it, but because something outside the story had shifted, forcing the narrative to bend, to adjust, to erase in ways that felt almost surgical. At first glance, it could be framed as a practical decision. Contracts end, stories evolve, new characters arrive, but nothing about this felt simple, because Maxie was never a character who could quietly fade into the background without consequence. Her presence had always been tied to emotional disruption, to secrets surfacing at the worst possible moment, to love that never came without a cost. Removing her from the center did not just create an absence. It created a void that the current storyline now seems to struggle to conceal. What makes this shift even more unsettling is how it aligns with the ongoing Nathan storyline, a narrative already built on fragile identities and emotional deception. Maxie's return had not been random. It had been purposeful, almost strategic. She awakened from a coma not just to reclaim her life, but to confront a reality that refused to make sense. The man she loved, the man she mourned, was suddenly standing in front of her again, but not as himself, not as Nathan. As Cassius, hidden behind a mask that everyone seemed willing to accept except her. That emotional fracture, that refusal to surrender to a comforting lie, was where Maxie's strength lived. And yet, just as that tension reached a point where it could explode into truth, the story pulled her back. Instead of allowing Maxie to drive the unraveling, the narrative shifted its weight elsewhere. Lulu became the emotional center of Nathan's new life, her presence rewriting the dynamic that Maxie had once defined. It was not just a romantic shift. It was a structural one. The story began to orbit around Lulu's connection, her influence, her role in grounding Cassius, even as the truth remained buried. Maxie, who should have been the storm at the center of this deception, was pushed to the edges, her anger softened, her instincts muted, her narrative potential quietly dismantled. This is where the sense of shock deepens into something more uncomfortable, because it no longer feels like a natural evolution. It feels like a forced correction, a recalibration designed to move the story forward without fully honoring the emotional logic that once made it compelling. Maxie's arc was not just paused, it was fragmented. The threads that once defined her resilience, her intuition, her refusal to accept illusions, have been left hanging, unresolved, as if the story itself no longer knows what to do with them. Behind the scenes, there are explanations that attempt to soften the impact. Kirsten Storms has faced personal challenges, including health concerns that have required her to step back and reassess her pace. She has relocated, chosen a different rhythm of life, one that does not always align with the demanding schedule of a long-running daytime drama. These realities matter. They provide context, but they do not fully dissolve the emotional dissonance that viewers are now experiencing. Because what unfolds on screen still needs to feel earned, still needs to respect the history that brought these characters to this point. And that is where the tension lies. General Hospital appears to be entering a period of recalibration, not just in casting, but in narrative focus. New faces are rumored to be arriving, new arcs being developed, new conflicts designed to reshape the landscape of Port Charles. There is a sense of transition, of strategic restructuring, as if the show is preparing for a different kind of storytelling, one that prioritizes new dynamics over established ones. In that process, characters like Maxie risk becoming collateral damage, not because they no longer matter, but because they no longer fit the direction being pursued. The idea that Maxie might simply exist off-screen, living her life beyond the edges of the narrative, feels like a compromise rather than a resolution. It suggests a character who is still alive in theory, but no longer essential in practice. And for someone who once carried so much emotional weight, that shift is difficult to accept, because Maxie was never meant to be background noise. She was meant to disrupt, to question, to expose. She was the character who saw through facades, who refused to let lies settle into comfort. Now, as the Nathan storyline continues to unfold, that absence becomes more pronounced. Cassius remains protected, his deception intact, his connection with Lulu deepening in ways that feel increasingly irreversible. The longer the truth is delayed, the more the story reshapes itself around that delay, building new emotional investments that will eventually be shattered. But when that moment comes, When the truth finally breaks through, one question will remain impossible to ignore. Where is Maxie in all of this? And more importantly, why was she not allowed to be the one who brought it to light? There is a quiet risk in the way this is being handled. By sidelining Maxie, the story may gain short-term flexibility, but it loses a layer of emotional authenticity that cannot easily be replaced. Because Maxie's connection to Nathan was not just romantic. It was deeply personal, rooted in loss, in memory, in a history that cannot simply be transferred to another character without consequence. Ignoring that connection does not erase it. It lingers, unresolved, waiting for a moment that may never come. And so, the shock of Kirsten Storms' contract ending is not just about an actress stepping away. It is about what that departure represents, a shift in priorities. A willingness to reshape the narrative even if it means breaking the internal logic that once held it together. A decision that prioritizes movement over meaning, progression over preservation. Yet, even within that uncertainty, there remains a fragile possibility. Maxie's story is not truly over. It has been interrupted, displaced, left in a state of suspension. And sometimes, in a world like Port Charles, what disappears does not stay gone forever. It waits, it gathers weight in the shadows, and when it returns, it does not come back quietly. If that moment ever arrives, it will not just be about revealing the truth behind Cassius. It will be about restoring something that has been missing, something that the story itself may not fully realize it has lost. Until then, the silence left behind by Maxie's absence will continue to echo, a reminder that not all exits are written with closure, and not all stories are allowed to end the way they deserve. The possibility that Maxie might leave Port Charles is no longer just a narrative adjustment. It is beginning to feel like a descent into something far darker, something that strips away the emotional core that once defined her story. There is a growing sense that her exit, if it unfolds the way current hints suggest, will not be gentle, not respectful, and certainly not worthy of the history she carries. Instead, it threatens to become one of the coldest turns the show has taken in years, a shift that replaces emotional payoff with shock value, leaving behind a hollow silence where meaning should have been. At the center of this darkness lies a theory that refuses to fade, no matter how unsettling it sounds. Maxie may have uncovered the truth about Nathan, not the illusion everyone else is willing to accept, not the carefully constructed version of reality that Cassius has been hiding behind, but the raw, dangerous truth beneath it. And if that is the case, then Maxie is no longer just a bystander pushed to the edges of the story. She becomes a threat, a liability, someone who knows too much in a narrative built entirely on concealment. That shift alone changes everything, because in a world where secrets are protected at any cost, knowledge is no longer power, it is a death sentence. What makes this possibility even more disturbing is how easily it aligns with the current direction of the storyline. Cassius has already proven that he is capable of manipulation, of reshaping identities, of inserting himself into lives that were never meant to be his. He exists in a space where morality bends, where survival overrides conscience, where protecting the lie becomes more important than preserving the people caught inside it. If Maxie stands in the way of that lie, then the logic becomes brutally simple. She cannot remain. And that is where the story begins to cross a line that many viewers are struggling to accept, because Maxie is not just another character who can be sacrificed for the sake of escalation. She is history. She is continuity. She's one of the few figures whose emotional journey has spanned loss, love, betrayal, and survival in ways that shape the identity of Port Charles itself. To reduce her to a plot device, to use her as a stepping stone in someone else's arc, is not just a narrative risk, it is a betrayal of everything the character has represented. The anger building among viewers is not rooted in resistance to change. General Hospital has always thrived on transformation, on reinvention, on pushing its characters into impossible situations. But there is a difference between evolution and erasure. What is happening with Maxie feels less like a natural progression and more like a dismantling. Her perspective has been muted. Her instincts, once sharp and relentless, have been sidelined. Her emotional stakes, once central, have been diluted until they barely register within the larger narrative. And now, the idea that her story could end in violence, in silence, in a disappearance that barely ripples through the canvas, feels like the final step in that dismantling. There is something deeply unsettling about the thought that Maxie's final act in Port Charles might not be one of defiance or revelation, but one of isolation, discovering the truth alone, realizing too late that no one is listening. That the connections she once relied on have shifted, fractured, or moved on without her, and in that moment when she stands closest to the truth, she is also at her most vulnerable. Because the story has already begun to move past her, already begun to center itself elsewhere, leaving her exposed in a narrative that no longer protects her. If Cassius is truly willing to go that far, to eliminate the one person who could expose him, then the consequences extend beyond Maxie's fate. It redefines the tone of the entire storyline. It transforms the Nathan arc from a mystery into something far more sinister, something that no longer hinges on emotional reconciliation, but on irreversible damage. And once that line is crossed, there is no easy way back, no simple redemption, no clean resolution that can restore what has been lost. Yet, what lingers even more than the fear of what might happen is the frustration over what has already been lost. Maxie's story did not have to end this way. It could have been a story of confrontation, of truth breaking through illusion, of a woman refusing to be silenced even when the world around her chose comfort over reality. It could have been powerful, devastating, unforgettable in the way that honors both the character and the audience that has followed her for so long. Instead, it risks becoming something quieter, colder, and far less meaningful. That is where the outrage finds its voice, not in the rejection of darkness, but in the rejection of emptiness. Viewers are not afraid of tragedy, they are afraid of insignificance. They are afraid that Maxie, a character who once carried so much emotional weight, will be written out in a way that feels like an afterthought, a narrative convenience rather than a culmination. And if that happens, the damage will not be limited to a single storyline. It will echo, reshaping how the audience trusts the story to handle its characters moving forward. Because in the end, the question is not just whether Maxie will leave Port Charles, or even how she will leave. The real question is whether her departure will mean anything at all. Whether it will carry the emotional truth that once defined her journey, or whether it will dissolve into the background, another shadow in a story that has already begun to forget her. And if the darkest possibility becomes reality, if Maxie's knowledge becomes the reason she is silenced, then what remains is not just loss. It is a warning. A signal that in this version of Port Charles, even the most enduring characters are not guaranteed a meaningful end, only an ending.